Welcome. Today is July 21st, and welcome to Industrial Marketing Live. I'm your host and sometimes subject matter expert, Matthew Shanella. Today, I am not the subject matter expert, though, because today I have Toby Wall with me. What's up, Toby?
Not too much, friend. How are you?
I'm good, and I appreciate you calling me friend instead of colleague or coworker. But I was thinking about topics for this week, and one of the things I recognize a lot, especially I recognized earlier in my career when I was making content, was how hard it was to get meaningful insights out of the people I was interviewing for content. And so much of it was because, you have people who just talk way up here, and your knowledge is like here. And so you got to figure out a way to ask those very incisive questions in order to balance that out and get what you need in order to make an impactful piece of content, whether that's something in a video interview or creating a webinar slide deck or a blog or even a podcast. If you want to come up with podcast topics and you want your subject matter expert to sound smart all the time, but not so smart that it's inaccessible. And that's an art and a science. And so I wanted to bring Toby on to talk about what that looks like. So first off, this is who we are. Toby is our content director at Gorilla. And Toby, I'll let you kind of go over your bona fides real quick, and then we'll get into the agenda, and then we'll roll right into it. But really what I want you all to get out of this is just having a plan for when you're doing a subject matter interview so you are better prepared for them. And so you are able to both do research at the outset and afterwards to fill out what you're making for whatever kind of content project that you're working on. So Toby, go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll get right into the agenda here.
Sure. As Matt said, and as my little cryon down there indicates, I'm the content director at Gorilla 76. I've been at the company for the males here.
Dog alert.
About 4.5 years. Is this? Hey, why don't you cut that out? She's not even that tough. She's a 80-pound German Shepherd, but she's just the biggest wood. She'll calm down here in a second. So I've been here a little over 4.5 years. I am the content director now, but I was a copywriter for just this entire time. I still do some of that now. Prior to
it's amazing to this webinar. This has been down. But anyway, just keep going.
Hang on one second.
All right, so that's the first ever interruption that I've had on this webinar where it's been a dog interrupting. But you know what? I'm gonna let it slide.
You know what it was? If I can just peel back the curtain a little bit, this was one of those guys who's coming by trying to sell me weed control. I'm glad I didn't go to the door. I don't want that.
Good. All right, go ahead.
Okay, I apologize for that, everybody. 4.5 years at the company. I have been a copywriter here that entire time. Prior to joining Gorilla, I was a newspaper reporter at various news outlets in central and southwestern Illinois. So the interviewing aspect of my experience really started there, brought a lot of that over to the marketing side of it. So I guess information I'll be able to share with you is a blend of, what I learned on the beat and then what I've learned doing this job.
Cool. All right, so let me go through the agenda real quick, and then we're going to kind of go back and forth a little bit here. So I'm going to start by just strategizing the subject matter interview, determining the right subject matter expert, and sometimes you don't find that out until it's too late. Research and prep, using the research for your interview, which is something that is a practice form. Devising the line of questioning, again, something to keep in mind. I think one of the hardest things, one of the things that I see all the time, and this especially happens in video, is getting a reserved subject matter expert to open up when you're talking to them. And then just some key takeaways for yourself. Just if there's anything you want to take away from this webinar, take this stuff away. So let's start here, Toby, with strategizing the subject matter interview. And I'm going to let you take it from here, and then I'll color in. Okay, go for it.
So we're starting with why, not who. Who comes later. But what does this mean? It's about strategy. You are nowhere in an interview, or in a, if the interview is in service of some kind of content piece you're producing, if the strategy is not sound, you are going to have a hard time. So these, what you see on the slide here, are the aspects of strategizing that interview. The first part, the most important part, is why. What are we even doing this for? If you can't answer that, or if the answer is I don't know, then do some more thinking. Part of figuring that out is, how does this audience interact? There's a lot of research that goes on kind of in the background where we figure this out. And this is something if we're thinking about work processes in the agency where Matt and I are, this is where strategists really come in handy. They are monitoring this pretty closely. Interactions like, what do they say online? What do they read? Do we know what they read? If we've interacted with them before, what have they said? Based on those interactions, we can make some interpretations maybe about the challenges that they're having. And that's a critical part of what makes a content piece good, or what's going to make an interview productive, is, are we able to approach this person's challenge? Do we know what's gone wrong? Do we know why it's a problem? Do we know what struggles they've had as they've tried to fix it? What have they tried? What worked and what didn't? And then it's a matter of understanding how widely this ripples out. You can know the problem, and that's pretty good, but you can go farther than that. Who does that problem impact? What other problems does that problem cause? It's like dominoes, right? If you set dominoes out in a circle and you push one over, eventually they all fall down. So it's important to know, I guess, the ecosystem or the universe or the whole galaxy of what's happening here. And when you have a good handle on all of those things, you're ready to start researching, to start thinking about, how am I going to talk to this person? How am I going to get the information that is going to make the biggest impact on the people who I want to see it?
Yeah, I think, understanding why it's a challenge, I think, is something that doesn't get considered when you're working on with your subject matter expert. Like, the challenge you're addressing, or at least the point you want to drive home, but you don't necessarily know what makes it a challenge for people, and identifying that ultimately is stuff you learn by taking the time to go talk to your target audience and ask them things like, what challenges do you have? Why are they challenges? What's the downstream effect of that for you? Who else does that affect within your department or outside your department? Having all of those understandings going in to a content piece, just as a filter by which to devise your line of questioning, will help you immensely in determining what to ask your subject matter expert in order to speak, because you're speaking to someone whenever you're making this content, right? Like, you're basically using your subject matter interview as an instrument to speak to your audience, right? So knowing who you're speaking to and why you're speaking to them in that manner will allow you to devise the right line of questioning, and also be able to adjust your line of questioning once you kind of get in with your subject matter interview and start actually going through the process of getting that knowledge out of their brain, right? You have nothing to add there? We're good?
No, I don't. Everything you said was 100% great.
All right, cool. All right, go for it.
How do you know who you should talk to? It might be harder than maybe it seems at first blush. Sometimes you do know, depending on the strategy you've arrived at, depending on the way that you've identified the problem that you're trying to solve, or the challenge you're trying to address for that audience. Depending on who that audience is, it could be pretty obvious who you must talk to. Other times it's not. And this is one of the unfortunate parts about, being in the information business, I'll call it, is that even though you may have planned really effectively, you aren't going to get it perfect every time. And sometimes whoever it is you get on the phone or on the screen, they're close, but they're not quite right. that's just something to be aware of and to be thinking about. You might be able to tell in the middle of the process, is this person going to be the one I need? Is this person going to give me what I need to share what I need to the audience or not? So there's ways you can determine this. It starts closest to you. Who do you have on your team? Who do they know? What are their professional or social networks like? Um, in my experience, you almost don't have to go outside of that. Somebody knows somebody, and that somebody knows somebody else, and you can track them down. And it's relatively easy to do. All you have to do is ask. And if you're armed with, we talked about in the last slide, if your strategy's good, then you can go back to these people and say, hey, who do you know? Here's why I want to talk to them. And this fills it out for them. Now they know, like, okay, I feel confident that this person will talk to me because, they know why someone's asking to speak to them.
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Yeah.
So when you find out you don't have the right person, like, someone on your team said, oh, you should talk to this guy about it. And then you talk to him and like, you start talking to him and you're like, this guy's not really giving me a lot. And then finally he tells you, and I've had this happen to me. He goes, I'm really not the person you should talk to. You should really talk to this guy. And I'm sure this has happened to you in your life as well. What do? Do you just simply make the best you can out of that and you go to that other person? Or do you just stop and go, look, let's just not even waste your time anymore, and let's just go to that person you suggested? Like, what happens when you run into that roadblock? Because that's a hard thing to run into, because first off, you're kind of starting back from square one, because I'm not even sure if it's trustworthy to take that person's word for it either, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things you should do in that case. One of them is, the very first thing you must do, if someone says, yeah, I'm really not the person you should talk to, and it happened to me a mere days ago, was the most recent time someone said this. The immediate follow-up question is, who is? If you're not the right person, then who is? And the absolute worst that can happen then is they don't tell you. They might say, I don't know who it is, but it ain't me. Okay, too bad. I guess you're out of luck there. But most of the time they'll tell you who's the right person. What else you can do, and this is kind of my MO, is if I've got someone on the phone and I still have enough time to have a good conversation with them, they might tell me, or it might emerge throughout the call, that they aren't the right person for what I'm looking for, but they're the right person for something. So I still want to talk to them. And maybe that means deviating from my question list. We'll talk about that in a few slides. Maybe that means really thinking on your feet and just, at that point, it's not at all scripted, not at all prepared for, and it's just a conversation between someone who knows stuff and someone who's curious. But I still want to talk to them because there's bound to be something there. You might not be able to use it right away, but stash it in the library because it will be useful to you at some point.
Gotcha. Good to know. All right. Let's dive into research here a little bit, because I feel like this is where this is what separates your really good content from your content that's really half-baked. And so I know you do this extensively. And so I want to kind of let you lead through this and how you approach research and where do you go to do it.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So let me start by saying why, or how do you start? And it all goes back again to strategy. Depending on what the topic is, and if it's a topic that I am not familiar with, I need to lean on something. There's got to be something I can chew on to start with. And so if your strategy, if the reasoning why you're doing a thing is clear and you understand it, that can give you a pretty good place to start. So where do I go? This is the cheap answer to everything is the search engine. Mm-hmm. But it's also probably the best. And there's multiple kinds of search engines, but what I'm trying to do is familiarize myself with a topic, and that starts broadly. What are the words that people are using, and what do those words mean? I'll get a handle on that, and then I'll, pour back over my strategy and start to think about how do these topics apply to the, the thrust of my argument, the point that I'm trying to make, or the main nugget that we want these people to get when they're reading the content. So for me, and others may do this differently. I know there's others, colleagues of ours on this call who'd be interested to see what they think about this. But when I research, I am developing questions and researching at the same time. This is partly because developing my question list helps me research. If I can sit there and pound out 5, 10 questions, and then, well, what would, I don't need to ask all 10 of those. Maybe I can ask those to the internet now. So I do this concurrently because I don't want to risk either an incomplete question list, or I don't want to risk having a bunch of questions that are sitting there that I could answer on my own.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an exercise of kind of doing two things at once, but they're both really, really important. You had asked about where do I go to find and what are the sources of information?
Let's dive into some of that stuff.
Yeah. So competitor websites, if you are aware enough of the ecosystem of whoever it is you're talking to, the other people who you're trying to beat are a pretty good source. Upstream suppliers, downstream suppliers, that's a good resource, because if we're thinking about problems, right? What are the ripple effects? Upstream and downstream, this is where those happen. And so that's a good place to look. It's another great place to look for specifically in industrial applications, because so often an industrial process happens here, but there's a lot more to it. Mm-hmm. There's raw material extraction, there's initial processing, there's transit, there's any number of steps along the way, and who I'm working for might just occupy one of those, but I want to know who else is involved, and what they think about, what they care about, what their problems are. So looking for up and downstream suppliers, great place to look.
Yeah, I think something I always find when it comes to that is that's really what separates good subject matter experts as well. Like, good subject matter experts know those up and downstream effects really well because they're studied on it. It's not enough for them to kind of know how it works pertaining to their system. They also want to know the effects of it on upstream and downstream. So in welding, for instance, which is where I have a lot of knowledge of, it's not just simply like the wire and the base metal, it's also the ventilation, it's also, touch up or grinding or finishing or painting, stuff like that. Just understanding how that metalworking goes into all those other jobs that go into making whatever that material or that product is at the end.
And I would add this, that often, if not all the time, the audience we're trying to reach if it's a technical topic or they're in some kind of technical field, those people also do not live in a vacuum. They also are aware of upstream and downstream, and
probably touch all of it in some way, shape, or form.
And they'll be able to tell if you produce content that is too narrowly focused, or that did not account for, here's all the other things that are happening in this world. They can sniff that from a mile away. And what does that do to your credibility?
Right, for sure. All right, let's talk about this, because you are a self-professed Wikipedia fan. Not everyone is. I honestly don't use it that much when I'm making content, but I want you to go through your spiel about why you like Wikipedia on top of some of these other resources here. These academic resources.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever scrolled down to the bottom of a Wikipedia entry and seen all those blue links?
Yeah, of course I have.
Cite your sources, and they do most of the time. They don't always, and you'll see, in parentheses, citation needed. But here's my soapbox about Wikipedia, because I went through, junior high school and high school not at the dawn of Wikipedia, but I guess shortly after. And it was the place you went where if you didn't want to quote unquote do actual research, you just found it on Wikipedia. And so they said, don't use Wikipedia as your source. And the reply I have to that now is, go find Wikipedia's editorial standards. They're probably stronger than almost any, rivaled only by National Public Radio or PBS or the New York Times. I mean, they don't mess around. And so there ought to be no stigma to using Wikipedia. Now, if you don't want to have a link to a Wikipedia article in content, I can see that. But like I said, that long list of blue links at the bottom, that's your gateway. This is the sources that someone has cited. And in industrial or manufacturing applications, I've observed that we are pretty lucky, because these tend not to be controversial topics. So you don't have this army of competing Wikipedia editors going back and forth trying to make changes. And so it's generally, the information is really, really good, and it's coming from really great sources. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about some of these other sources now, because it's not just Wikipedia. Academic articles. Granted, you got to pay for those sometimes, unless you have subscriptions to JSTOR is one of them, LexisNexis, among other things. What's that?
We'll get into those. This is more about like colleges and stuff like colleges or like ISO.
Mm-hmm. So that being a standards organization, there's a ton of others too. There's ASTM's popular in our world, ASME's popular in our world. These are, highly reputable bodies who just put information out there. It's an exceptional resource. Even more exceptional if you have access to, like if you have the actual standard, for example, an ISO standard it's a gold mine if what you're talking about, what you're asking about matters. It's great for context. Yeah. Your company probably has an ISO standard of some kind. I'm sure you should ask, it'd be something your production manager or your head of engineering may have, because they're more interested in it to make sure that they're building something to ISO standards so they can keep certification. For you as a marketer or a content creator, though, you should definitely, if they have that, ask them about it and have a copy for yourself as it pertains to what you're going to make content about. Because I know in my experience, like my company had ISO standards and I was able to access it when I needed to, and it was always a good resource. Absolutely. All right, let's talk public forums, which is a little bit more of a different approach. This is one where I will not so loudly proclaim it. There's a time and a place where these come in. Public forums are not. It's not a link. It's not a hyperlink you'll ever see in an article I write. But here's where I use these. Let's say I'm talking about a technical topic that exists alongside other technical topics. Maybe it's a process, maybe it's a material. In industry, of course, there's more than one way to eat a Reese's. And people have feelings about these, and there's evangelists for all the different topics that are out there. So if you're on Reddit or if you're on Quora is another one that I've seen. Yes, Quora is a great one. Finding these people who talk about technical topics, I wouldn't rely on it as source material, but what I do with those is grab people's quotes, throw them in my interview question list, and put this to the expert and say, look, here's something that I've seen somebody say. What's your reaction to that? Are they right or are they wrong? Or are they somewhere in the middle? Give me the nuance here. Why, it's like, the way I treat it is what I see on forums, it's like the outlines, and I want my subject matter expertise to color those in. Yeah. And those are a great place. Those are a great place to find them. Another cool thing about forums is that if you're ever struggling with what are the words people are using to talk about a thing,
Just about to say that. Yeah.
they use those words there, and it's a great place to find that, because it's all conversational. So they're going to say it the way they'd say it if they were talking.
Yeah. Goes all the way back to that slide about the language people are using, and then, leveraging that in your questioning. And like,
Mhm.
if you're struggling to get access to talk to a customer, or, go visit someone with your sales team or something like that, the next best option is to go on these forums and just go peruse through, especially topics where there's a lot of conversation going on back and forth about it. Usually you will, not so surprisingly, find that to be about some of the real basic things, where people have a million different ways that they prefer to do it, and they'll explain to you why. But it's a really good way to figure out how they talk about things, the kind of language they use. Maybe it's not the same as the technical language that your company uses, and maybe that's something you need to look at as you make content and how you refer to it. But again, like, I think public forums are really good resources for stuff like that. It's also really good if you're looking for a content strategy and you want to make sure you cover the basics. It's a really good way to go find those other basic questions that maybe you have a blind spot about.
Yeah, that's a I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's a really interesting, maybe call it a cheat code.
Mhm.
You
For
see a
sure.
lot of disagreement, or you see a lot of question marks instead of periods, you might have a
Topic.
content topic on your
Yes,
hands.
you do, for sure. All right, let's start. This one I like a lot. You talked about court documents, and when we talked about this in our prep, I was like, court documents. I never even thought of that. But go ahead and explain that.
You'd be astonished at what you can learn about somebody based on what they are sued for. Um, I and I have examples where this has been meaningful to me, and I don't want to drag anybody, so I'm not going to talk about names, but I will explain vaguely a scenario where this has been really helpful. And I stumbled on it by accident. Uh, using your search engine of choice, whatever topics you put in, you might find that it is the summary of a summary ruling from a court case, or you might find that it's something, a piece of discovery that was submitted as part of a court case. And what this did for me in this case, and what it might do for you if you choose to try it, is if you want to know how, like, the background, how a thing works, this is sort of a neat way to learn more about that. This is the closest I'll come to the specific example that I'm thinking of right now that this happened, which is some folks that we'd worked with who provide administrative services to an agricultural co-op were party to a lawsuit. Now, just because someone's party to a lawsuit doesn't mean something bad happened. There's all kinds of reasons why somebody goes to court. So just keep that in mind, because it really wasn't anything nefarious at all. But by reading these court documents, what I found was a pretty intimate and unbiased look at how these groups relate to one another, how they work together, what are the breakdowns between how these people work. What did that do for me? Well, in this case, one of the parties to this court case was a member of this agricultural co-op. Agricultural co-ops happen to be a audience of ours, somebody who we are working to reach through marketing efforts of this company that we were working for. Was not a better way to understand how the interplay between co-op and the people who do their administrative services. It was just really, really great. So what you're seeing on the screen here are two of the many places you can go to find court cases. LexisNexis is probably the most popular, the most commonly used, because it grabs probably largest swath of information from across the spectrum. Pacer is, if you're going to use Pacer, Pacer's great. It's federal, only federal. So if you're going to search, and you can search by somebody's name or company type or whatever. So that's one avenue. The other avenue I would say is if you know what county something happened in, or you want to take a guess at what county something happened in, cross your fingers and then go to that county's website and see if they have court records online. This is, I literally made my living in the newspapers, bouncing back and forth between Pacer and the county websites. It is just a mountain of information, provided you know how to use it and know where to look.
Fascinating. All right, now let's go from like the most official to your other favorite like search engine, which is YouTube. And again, I was surprised when you use this one, but you'd say YouTube is supremely underrated. Why?
Because, at least in my case, if I am writing content or doing an interview with somebody that depends on an understanding of the way a process is supposed to work, or the way that a machine works, I need to see it. And descriptions online tend to be either way too complex, or so vague that it might as well just not have said anything. So if I can see, I'm having like really fun flashbacks because you have this overview of plastic processes down there. I've looked up plastic extrusion so many times with so many other like corresponding search terms, just because YouTube is such a good resource for that. So if you need to see something, then this is where you ought to go to do it. Why? So let's translate that back to content. I'm primarily in the written form. I can describe something really well in writing after I've seen the way that it works. To bring this back to subject matter interviewing, I can frame questions really well. I can ask about how does this work when I've seen an example of it. Mm-hmm. Or I can pose a question and then understand why I'm wrong. If someone says, no, that's not correct, here's what's correct. Well, I've seen it either the right way or the wrong way. And that's very helpful. I don't know what the statistic is now, but I think it was a couple years ago. YouTube, if I'm not mistaken, is the second most popular search engine on the internet.
It is, for sure.
And if you're in industrial or manufacturing, give it a try. Even if you don't think you'll find something there, you would be surprised. There's always something there.
All right, so let's bring it all back here to the actual using that research to your advantage when it comes to that subject matter interview. So you've gone on Pacer, you've done some YouTube stuff, you've looked up Wikipedia in those deep blue links. You got everything you need. So how do you use this research to your advantage?
So we're back here to the concept of researching and question prep at the same time. I'll reiterate that that's really useful because you can start to answer your own questions, and you put a finer point on the questions you do want to ask, or add some depth to the questions that you want to ask. Starting high, narrowing down. This is my way of understanding the forest and then starting to talk about individual trees. I tend to be really procedural when I'm doing interview questions. Research helps me get very, very systematic in the questions that I'm asking. We'll talk a little bit later about, what happens if you don't need all of those questions? There's an answer to that, but another thing that research helps me do, and I've got some neat examples of this, is to add color to your interviews and eventually add color to the content that emerges from that. Let me share what those are. Matt has one of these on his slide here. we were doing some work for a company that builds testing equipment for protective coatings. And as part of this, we were doing a content series on corrosion. If you paint something, paint is a good way to stop corrosion. So we were talking about the different types of corrosion and the problems that can occur if those are left untouched. We could just talk about corrosion of dissimilar metals in an electrolytic environment and leave it at that. And most of the people in this audience would understand what that meant. But I think it's always better if you can inject some storytelling to that, just to really hit it home what the stakes are. And this is what happened. We see here in Guadalajara, a bunch of gas lines underground under their streets. Somebody or a company had installed a new gas line, and it was pretty close to an existing gas line. They were made of different materials. And in certain conditions, that's okay, different metals can coexist, but in other conditions, like warm and humid conditions, you create an electrolytic environment which can lead to corrosion. And this corrosion was not detected, and it corroded through one of these pipes so badly that the streets began to explode. And horrible tragedy. So, you know what the lesson is there. Be diligent in your coding. Also, maybe don't put two pipes so close together underground. Another fun, and this one is a much lighter, happier example, is one of our clients built a distribution center in Spokane, Washington. And in order to prepare the site ahead of foundation, this is what they call the dirt work, they ran across these really big boulders nobody knew were there. And the people responsible for removing these boulders went about their work, got these boulders out of the way. Well, what they didn't know, and what nobody really knew, is that there was some period in Central Oregon's geologic history where glaciers dumped a bunch of really big rocks down in this, in that region. And so we were able to talk about, like, what happened in the geology of Spokane and how did that impact this construction project. It was just a really cool way to inject some life and some vigor into what would have been just here's a story about
very boring piece about site work.
Right. Yeah, it's like, oh, the bulldozers came and they did the thing that they do and then they left, and you could leave it at that, or like, well, we can have a little distraction into the very ancient history of North America.
Right. That's why research is good, though, right? It gives you color to, like, go to your subject matter and go, all right, so this happened. So, how did you all deal with that? But you're able to give, like, all this backdrop to that sort of work that happened, why it happened. There's like this chain of events that led to it. And just that prep allows you to really put all that stuff into context, I think, in a way that will make your content a lot more interesting as a result.
Absolutely. It's you can get so much more mileage, I think, out of it that way, in terms of making the point you want to make or making the argument that you want to make in your content piece. It's because, to go back to that example, this was, you did the dirt work and then they built the building. But the thing was, they did the dirt work. Here, these rocks are the size of Volkswagens. And are they going to get these out of the ground in time? And once they get these out, are they going to have to replace it with clean fill? What are they going to do? Is this going to put the project behind? Are they going to get this done on time? Think of all these other questions now that you can ask because you found this thing.
Let's get to the interview itself here. So once you sit down with this person, it's really natural to be, you've done all your prep, but let's face it, you're not the subject matter expert. So when you hear something that you weren't prepared for, and that will happen, it's easy to get a little bit off your game a little bit. Like, you have this way that you kind of foresee this Q&A playing out. It never kind of plays out that way. Someone, I'm sure you've done this hundreds of times in your career. Talk a little bit about how you approach the interview itself and adjust for those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so important to remain conversational. Have some sympathy for the person that you are talking to, unless they have also compiled mountains of notes. They are just going to be talking. And so it's really important and has been helpful in my career, I suppose, to meet them where they are. And it's just a conversation. I'm asking questions. Now, what does that require on my end in the background? I am crafting interview questions conversationally, which is, that takes some work. I'm asking these the way that I talk. It does pay off. We also want to stay curious when we're interviewing, and this means keeping an open ear. Do not close yourself into this narrow question list. You'll get into trouble if you stay there and just think that, everything on this page is my universe and I cannot leave here. You're going to miss something. So we get to the bullet here of active listening, and here's a term that's, really, really overused, I think, in a lot of different areas, but it is important. And here's what we mean by that. Someone may answer a question unpredictably. You might anticipate that they'll say, or that they'll give a certain answer to a question that you have. You may have laid out your questions in a way that you anticipate the course of several minutes of the conversation, but it doesn't always work that way. So active listening in my mind means understanding if you are about to be led down a path you didn't think about, something that was not quite clear to you when you were making your questions, but going down that path anyway. The really great way to derail an interview is to hear somebody say something interesting that you had not prepared for, and then just move on to the next question that you had prepared for. Real buzzkill. Don't do that. Another thing I want to add here is that, and you had teed this up just a minute ago, Matt, was they are the subject matter expert, not me. So even though I've got the question list and I've done all this research and I'm, perhaps thinking that I can predict where this conversation is going to go, they might lead me somewhere different, and I need to trust them that where we're going to go is productive, because they do know this far more than I do. So it's a risk management play, really.
Yeah. I think another thing on the interview I just thought about as we were watching this and listening to you is asking the same question twice if you don't like the answer you get. Sometimes people appreciate the mulligan and a chance to sort of re-answer the question if you reframe it in a different way or ask it in a different way. And I've often found with interviews I've done, they appreciate the chance to re-answer the question a little bit. Because you give them permission to expand on it a little bit more than they did previously. They also, frankly, they already answered it once, so they're thinking about it a little bit subconsciously when you bring it back to them. And then the other thing is, like, sometimes the best answers you get for that content piece are never the ones that you write. They're always the follow-up. So they're always the crutch phrases that we have here on the bottom as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I know that Grace is here listening too on this webinar. I don't know, Grace, between the two of us, how if we had a sandwich for every time this has happened to us, we could buy lunch for the company for a year. So yeah, there's just so much gold there. There's so much pay dirt in trusting your subject matter expert, and it might require thinking on your feet, thinking quickly. It's it's worth doing that. We have some crutch phrases here at the bottom because you will be caught off guard. So here's what you can do maybe if you want to buy time. One of the ways you can do this, Matt said, is just literally ask the question again. Whoever you're talking to, they might not have understood you the first time. It's not because they don't want to answer your question. So ask the question again, or tell me more about that. It could be just as simple as that, and they will find a way to tell you more. Maybe, and here's one that I like to do because it injects, some direction to the follow-up is, well, tell me more about how this works in the real world. How have you seen this work? Or, conversely, how have you seen this fail? So those are great ways to, if you think of your initial question like a tree, it's going to have branches, and you might even in advance, if you're kind of concerned that you don't know where the answer is going to go, put those branches down there as bullet points after your question, and anticipate maybe that something might go, I won't say off the rails, because it's not bad when this happens, but if it goes a direction that you can't quite anticipate.
Yep. All right, let's talk about questions that maybe don't make sense, and then the art of knowing the questions not to ask.
This is so hard to do because it's multitasking. And you will, depending on the method you use to write your questions, or how you how detailed or how procedural you want your question doc to get. And this happens to me a lot because I'm very, very procedural in my questioning, is that someone will answer, I'll ask one question, they will answer the next three on my list in that first answer. And this is where we get back to, don't be married to your question list, but keep a close eye on it, because you may need to skip. And again, it's going to kind of derail the conversation if all you did was just keep asking these questions, because whoever you're speaking with is going to say, well, I just answered that. So that's one thing. Another thing is, questions might not make sense. We were talking about the ways that, and someone's answer can deviate. Well, if someone's answer deviates to a question, that might mean that the next couple of questions I've planned for aren't going to make sense. And this is really just, unfortunately, it's a judgment call on your part. Should I ask this or should I not? Should I skip this or should I not? I think as you get more and more experienced in a certain topic, you can make that call better. My advice is, if it's a topic you are not familiar with at all, go ahead and ask the questions and apologize for asking, but say, I just want to be clear about this. Can you help me understand this? This is my next question about whatever. So it kind of is an art form, and it's kind of scary when it happens in an interview. But if it comes down to trust.
Mm.
Knowing that what question not to ask means, you're putting some faith in the person that you're talking to. And, most of the time, this is a very smart person. That faith is well placed.
Right. And that trust works both ways, right? Like when you make them look good with the content piece that they put their name on, they have much more trust in answering those questions for you with a lot more detail and a lot more, just a lot more expansion next time, because they're not going to believe or have the feeling that you're going to waste their time. You're going to elevate them in the eyes of their peers. And, when it comes down to it, there's always a little bit of prestige involved, right? People wanting to look good in front of their peers and understand that their expertise is being utilized for good, however they care to define that. So I think it's definitely a two-way street when it comes to those sorts of interviews. When you build that trust, that makes making subsequent content a lot easier with that person.
Mm-hmm. And I can share an example of these two concepts working together. A few days ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, I was speaking with a I guess, sort of a senior manager, VP level in for a company that owns many, many manufacturing plants. We were talking about automation, and I had been under the impression, based on previous notes and research, that there was a project in progress that and a process in one of their plants that they were poised to automate. And much of my question list was based on this assumption or this intel. Well, that wasn't necessarily true. And so I had to just walk away from half of my questions and say, well, what is going on the ground there? What is happening? And this was, the whole dynamic changed. I'm following this person now, but I suppose that they felt they could trust me, because we did have a great conversation about what really was happening in their circumstance. So it was the questions not to ask. I mean, it ended up being like 8 or 10 questions that went unasked, because it was just clear, no, it doesn't matter, it's not relevant.
Right. Yeah, definitely knowing questions not to ask are super important. All right, let's talk about, everyone's had this in their life, the quiet SME. This is really frustrating for me when I know my quiet SME is actually like in a social setting, a loud, boisterous SME who likes to have a good time. But when you put it in a professional setting or you put a camera in front of their face, they clam up like they're a kid getting their picture taken. So I want to talk a little bit about getting that quiet subject matter expert to open up a little bit and get the most out of them. So let's go all the way back to the beginning of this presentation. They're the right person. You've talked to them before. You've done prep work. Like, this is the guy or the girl that I want to talk to, but I can't get them to give me the goods when I'm in this formal setting with them. How do you go about doing that?
Your first point there, and you mentioned it just a second ago, repetition is one, and it's probably the easiest thing you can do. And in a lot of the cases, that does work. Just repeat the question. This is a way of saying, without really saying, hey, you didn't answer the question. I want you to answer the question. So repeating the question or rephrasing it, saying it a little bit differently in case they've misunderstood what you said, is a great tactic that you can use. And I would, kind of a 300 or 400 level tip for you is, if you're looking at your question list, try to anticipate which of these questions are the ones you might need to repeat or rephrase. Is this a complex question? Are you asking multiple things at once? Is the topic really dense? What would you need if someone said, oh, I don't really understand, or the answer they gave you was not that great? How might you anticipate what needs to change? And if you can do that in advance, it's helpful. You can see my cat's tail here on this bottom. She's jumped into my lap. Hang on. Okay. It's just a petting zoo around.
Cats and dogs and content.
Another tactic you might try is to make statements rather than asking questions, because another one of the arts of interviewing is the art of being wrong. And so if you say something rather than ask something, somebody who's quiet may not be able to resist the impulse to correct you. From time to time, topics will get sensitive, whether that's because you're talking about something controversial or you're talking about something proprietary. Proprietary is the most common in our experience.
Yeah, I hate that. And I just think it's a cop-out.
Right. Well, look, I agree most of the time. And it's not as if I can reach through the phone and, shake them by their lapels and say, look, just tell me what I want to know.
Product's not that proprietary. Let's put it that way.
So if something like that happens, I'll say, if this is proprietary, can we talk in the abstract? It's not this specific process, but it's something that's like it. What would you do in theory?
Yeah,
right.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
This is the content marketing version of what you would do if you're talking to someone off the record in the newsroom. Like, okay, you don't want to say this on the record. Press pause. Let's go off the record for a minute and let's talk. And then we'll get back to, back to the real interview and say, okay, because that's how you can start kind of tweaking your questions a little bit to get the information you need without really going somewhere too
Right.
sensitive.
That also usually gets you the proprietary information you're looking for, or close to it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have enough knowledge as the content creator to reword it in a way that's not going to give away the goods. And ultimately you need that, right?
Oh,
So,
right.
yeah.
Because if you didn't get that and you were just left to having the really wishy-washy answer to that instead of the proprietary answer, then the best you're going to do in content is just this wishy-washy description of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And who's going to be able to see themselves in that? Who's going to be able to identify with that or believe that that's a solution to their problem? This final point here, and I suggest use this maybe only sparingly, and maybe if it's somebody who you're very familiar with, who you've spoken with before, but it could be just a matter of, hey, look, I'm not really getting what I need. Would you mind, filling in some of the blanks here? Would you mind saying more on this? I want to share an example of how this has happened in the past. I've got two actually, getting quiet or reluctant people to talk some more. In one case, we had a senior level executive at a foam manufacturing company. We were talking about how an instance where they were integrating some new equipment in one of their plants in the US. And this person just was really reluctant to answer questions in general. I don't know, maybe he was uncomfortable being interviewed. This happens a lot, especially if it's, science-based people sometimes aren't really wired for conversations of the sort that we're having. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they're just downright don't want to talk to me, and it happens too. In order to get what I needed from this person, it was a matter of partly the bottom point in your slide, partly the second point, but making statements and providing some background after the question. Here's what I want to know, but this is why. Your answer to this question is going to help us do X, Y, Z for who we're working for. And so when somebody has added context, when someone understands why you're asking what you're asking, then oftentimes I've seen them open up. Another example is, and this is where we're talking about topic might get sensitive, talking to a manager of a landfill on the East Coast. And this is in reference to one of our clients who sells products and services for the landfill industry, the solid waste industry. And this person didn't want to talk in too much detail about a certain event that occurred at the site. The event that occurred resulted in complaints from neighboring businesses and residents and what have you in that area. Now that's a serious thing. And these kinds of complaints, very bad for their reputation. Landfills generally do not have good reputations anyway. I mean, think about your closest landfill. What is the relationship like there with the community? So this person,
landfill.
This person, and maybe rightly so, was really reluctant to talk to me about some of these specific circumstances. He didn't want to speak without having, talking to his supervisor. And this was an instance where, no matter how much permission I sought or how careful I was, this was just a case where he's not going to talk. And okay, here, you can't, like I said, you can't reach through the phone and shake them. Mm-hmm. And if they won't talk, they won't talk. And it's a matter of how can I make the best use of the time? What can I get from this person? What can I learn?
Right. I think some of the things you could do is just when you start calling them out directly, like try to inject a little humor when you call them out. If you can
Mhm.
get them to laugh, that'll get them to open up, right? And so when you kind of get them in between those questions, this is something if you have rapport, right? Because I've done this before. I've done video with a guy. He was awesome, just talking, shooting it in the office. I get him in front of a camera. He froze like a deer in the headlights. And finally, I was just like, and finally, we just started making bloopers. And then all of a sudden, he opened up and got a lot better afterwards.
Mhm.
I started feeding him questions. So sometimes, if you have good rapport with the person, if you can make them laugh, all of a sudden they're going to be way more easy asking and answering questions for you. All right, we've gone an hour now, Toby. I want to try to keep this tight if we can. Key takeaways here.
Mhm.
I'll go ahead and roll through. Do you have anything you want to add for color? Go for it. So first off, all starts with knowing why you're doing it. If you don't know why you're making the content, you need to scrutinize your content strategy. I can't stress it more than now. There's so much noise out there, and I'm a huge fan of quantity when it makes sense. But now more than ever, quality in your content matters. Like you have to have the highest standard of quality when you ship content out. Otherwise, it's just going to be white noise out there as far as everyone else is concerned. The other thing, be dogged. Get what you need and nothing less than that. Like you need to be, it's almost like you have to be in search for the truth. You're like an investigative journalist out there to find the truth as it's understood and make sure that you get that. I like this tip from you, Toby. Build a library, save notes, record calls. You should always be doing this as a best practice because there's so many nuggets you can go back out to reach towards. You can also color future things that you know. Really, really good tip there. And then treating content like a cycle. There is never a last word on any topic. This is especially true in manufacturing or in tech, where innovation moves very fast. Also, needs change so fast. So, like before, it was, it was like labor. Now it's supply chain logistics. So, when you look at the issues that people face, it becomes cyclical and there's different challenges that they meet. Other one was offshoring, right? So when you look at the challenges of the industrial sector, especially, which is our little neck of the woods, there's never a last word on the topic because the needs and the challenges always change.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me add just three little points to those last 3 points. That's all very good stuff. Um, Being dogged, getting what you need. I would say think about your audience, get what they need. And this kind of goes back to the strategy. You know why you're doing it. You know how this is going to help. The process becomes a lot easier. Maybe it helps motivate you much more when you know who you're doing this for. Do it for them. All of the things about building a library that Matt said are true. One thing I'd add to that is you might not be the only person doing this, or you won't be there where you are forever. Someone's going to come after you. Do them the favor of building this library of information up for them. They can carry it on. And then finally, treating content like it's a cycle. Look, it goes online, and sometimes we think it's etched in stone, but something's going to change. Take the thing down, spend a few minutes, make some adjustments. It can go back up. It's so much more flexible than maybe we think that it is.
For sure. All right. So we've got an hour. I'm not seeing any questions right now, which is cool. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Toby or myself. We want to try to keep this tight for you guys. I know an hour is a lot to ask. I thank you all so much for coming, as you do every time we have one of these. So appreciate it. We will send this deck out to all the registrants. So appreciate that. Resources, reach out to myself on LinkedIn, Toby on LinkedIn. Here's some of the resources that we recommend. I will reach back out to you all for our next webinar, which we will have next month. And until then, man, thank you all so much for attending Industrial Marketing Live. For Toby, I'm Matt, and we'll see you all next time, man. Thank you guys.